Following the innovations of Cubism, around 1910, artists in Moscow were starting their own revolution. One ambitious example is this model of Vladimir Tatlin's Monument to the Third International, here reconstructed in London. At first, the Russians seemed open to the newest ideas in art.
We proclaim today to you people to whom art is no mere ground for conversation, but the source of real exaltation, our word and deed.
They issued manifestos, sometimes posted in the streets, in attempts to clarify their aims.
The impasse into which art has come in the last 20 years must be broken.
For these Russians, the impasse had been broken by Malevich, whose famous Black Square astonished Moscow in 1913, and by Picasso, whose Paris studio Tatlin had visited earlier that year. There, Tatlin saw Picasso's unprecedented experiments with wood, wire, and sheet metal. Returning to Moscow, Tatlin made his own use of wire, glass, and sheet metal, which led finally to his spiral tower and his coining the term constructivism, a term picked up by other artists.
The plumb line in our hands, eyes as precise as a ruler, in a spirit as taut as a compass. We construct our work as the universe constructs its own.
The constructive sculpture is constructed.
Naum Gabo, another constructivist sculptor.
It is made of nothing, and then the structure was built up. So it is a construction.
Tatlin conceived of an art for the people. It was soon clear, however, that some of the avant-garde and the new regime were not made for each other. In 1922, certain constructivists lost favor. Tatlin, more conformist, stayed in Russia, while Gabo and his brother Antoine Pevsner took constructivist ideas to the West. Gabo's last home was Connecticut.
Space is not a subject, space is a material in my work. That means that space should participate in the making of a sculpture, a construction, just like you use solid material. You can make a cube where the space is enclosed. That is the way the old sculpture was done. You can, however, make the same cube where the space is free. And if you study the head, for instance, you will see that the whole head consists of small pockets of space. Leaving the space free, a sculptor can construct in this space another image of the same object. So that is what is the difference between Cubism and my work.
Antoine Pevsner, Gabo's brother, settled in Paris and was adopted by the French. Pevsner, like Gabo, was enthusiastic about new man-made materials, such as plastics and wire, materials that invite space, light, and shadow to become an integral part of the work. The two expatriate Russians, Pevsner in France and Gabo in Germany, England, and America, had a purity of intention that raised their art above all nationality.
We also demand that we should not make images which would increase the destructive spirit in man. It should give the man a sense of reason to live. Anyhow, it should be mentally constructive.
Constructivism had a continuing influence on 20th century sculpture, as reflected in the work of later artists, and in such monuments as Gabo's recent fountain in London and his 1957 tower in Rotterdam, the largest constructivist sculpture he made. The movement, though durable, had narrow acceptance. It was cold, logical, and without dramatic heroes. The public favored the image of the artist as a bohemian genius. Rose C'est la vie, alias Marcel Duchamp, who adopted a female alter ego in 1920, a pun on the word eros and the French c'est la vie. Duchamp's iconoclasm influenced artists of diverse talents and purposes, including eventually the pop generation.
I think that people in general, when they say, I know, they don't know, they believe. I believe that art is the only form of activity in which man, as man, shows himself to be a true individual. Art is an outlet towards regions which are not ruled by time and space. To live is to believe. That's my belief.
New York City, the celebrated Armory Show of 1913. Duchamp became an international celebrity. Guards restrained angry art lovers from damaging his painting, nude descending the staircase. Outraged critics said it was a symbol of the insanity of modern art. As for Duchamp, he said the scandal was very pleasant.
It was really a very important moment in my life. I had done what I could with Cubism, in my opinion, and immediately wanted to change. I wanted to go back to a completely dry conception of art, which is the formula of the chocolate grinder. The mechanical drawing, for me, was the best form of that form of art.
Struck by the mechanics of a chocolate grinder he saw in a shop window, Duchamp renounced painting. He sensed a new vocabulary for creating art.
And this was the real beginning for the large glass, because it was based on a perspective view, meaning complete control of the placement of things. It couldn't be haphazardly or changed afterwards.
But Duchamp found an ironic rationale for an accident that befell his enigmatic work, the large glass.
And the more I look at it, the more I like it. They put the two panes on top of one another on a truck, flat, not knowing what they were carrying, and bouncing for 60 miles in Connecticut. So that's what happened. But the more I look at it, the more I like the cracks because they have a shape. There's a symmetry in the cracking. There's more, almost an intention there, an extra curious intention that I'm not responsible for, ready-made intention, in other words, that I respect and love.
The revolutionary ready-mades, introduced by Duchamp in 1913. Commonplace objects, a bicycle wheel, a bottle rack. He challenged the world's notion of art by taking ready-made objects from their normal context and exhibiting them as art.
This is a ready-made dating back from 1916. It's a ball of twine between two plaques of copper, brass. And before I finished it, Arsberg put something inside the ball of twine, and never told me what it was, and I didn't want to know. It was a sort of secret, and it makes a noise, so we call this a ready-made with a secret noise, and listen to it. I never know, I don't know, I will never know whether it's a diamond or a coin. This is a ready-made bird cage with, if you see me, having a hard time because this is not sugar. This is marble and it weighs a ton.
The 1920s saw the end of Duchamp's whimsical ready-mades. Although he continued to produce various works, he devoted most of his remaining life to chess. The acceptance of his art, its popularity, was not what he wanted or expected.
It's the same thing with my life in general. I didn't want to pin myself down to one little circle. For example, that's why I took up chess. I took it very seriously and enjoyed it. When you play a game of chess, it's like design something or constructing a mechanism of some kind by which you win or lose. The thing itself is very, very plastic.
Duchamp's keen sense of mockery and his unrelenting assault on traditional conceptions of art made him a pioneer spirit and a major influence in the international Dada movement. What is Dada? It emphasized the irrational, the rebellious. It rejected every moral, social, and aesthetic code. This cult of the irreverent, christened in Zurich, made headlines in Paris after the First World War. Jean Arp, a founder of the movement, said,
"When Dada revealed its eternal wisdom to man, man laughed indulgently and went on talking. Man talks enough to make the very rats sick to their stomach. He talks so much that the day darkens and the night pales with fright. He talks so much that the sea runs dry and the desert turns to swamp."
Man Ray, the expatriate American, used unlikely combinations and elaborated on ready-mades to ridicule the establishment. He was recently called the last of the red-hot Dadas. The writer Tristan Tzara warned,
Dada doubts all. Watch out for Dada. Anti-Dadaism is a disease. But the true Dadas are against Dada. Dada has 391 different attitudes and colors depending on the sex of the cherry. It transforms itself, screams, goes fishing. Dada is dead. Dada is idiotic. Hurrah for Dada.
Voor Dada daar waar Dada daar.
Rinsiket de baby in skrmu. Romft heeft ho, romft heeft ho, ziu, romft heeft ho, ziu, en
Tzara added,
There are men who have said Dada is good because it isn't bad. Dada is bad. Dada is religion. Dada is magic.
Dada ist eine Rose, die eine Rose im Knopfloch trägt.
The great mystery is a secret, but it is known to a few persons, and they will never say what Dada is.
Of course, as usual, a group of people don't get together very long. 2 years or 3 years of it was enough, and they began fighting together. They hated each other. So they dispersed, and another group formed itself on the ashes of Dada to become the Surrealists.
in the mid-20s, Surrealism developed out of Dadaism. André Breton, apologist of the movement, put it this way.
Surrealism, thought dictated in the absence of all control exerted by reason, and outside all aesthetic or moral preoccupations.
At a studio in Paris, the Spanish artist Juan Miró, a key figure in the movement. Breton called him the most surrealist of us all. After coping with Dada antics, conversation in Paris cafes turned to the new art sensation, surrealism. The surrealist group as seen through the eyes of Max Ernst. Artists, writers, filmmakers, poets. André Breton, author of the Surrealist Manifesto, said,
Surrealism, such as I conceive of it, could serve to justify the complete state of distraction which we hope to achieve here below. I believe in the future resolution of those two states, dream and reality, into a kind of absolute reality, or surreality, if one may call it so.
Surrealism explores the dream, the nightmare, the dark side of reality, the erotic side of fantasy. Illumined Pleasures by Salvador Dali. The enigmatic Yves Tanguy, whose work suggests the landscape of another planet. Surrealism also shaped the early careers of Alberto Giacometti, Alexander Calder, Henry Moore, Barbara Hepworth. Among the poets of the movement was Paul Eluard, who wrote,
Around 1919, when the imagination sought to rule and subdue the dismal monsters strengthened by war, Max Ernst resolved to bury old reason, which had caused so many discords and disasters.
Max Ernst reflected the enchantment and terror of childhood memories. Eluard said,
It is not far as the crow flies from cloud to man. It is not far by images from the nature of real things to the nature of imagined things.
Poetry and painting were the chief vehicles for surrealist ideas and values. Ernst's sculptures, since the 1930s, reveal the compatibility of that three-dimensional medium with the uninhibited images of surrealism. Jean Arp, sculptor and poet.
The content of a sculpture should reveal itself on tiptoe, without pretension, like the track of an animal in the snow.
Jean Arp was perhaps the gentlest of all the founders of Dada. In the 20s, he moved into surrealism. Arp's lyrical shapes were often affectionately erotic, but never vulgar or earthbound. He explained,
I draw things that recline, drift, rise, ripen, fall. I model fruits that lie still, clouds that drift on and up, stars that grow ripe and drop. From an undulating sky fleece, a sheet arises. The sheet metamorphoses into a torso. The torso metamorphoses into an amphora. A mighty navel appears. It grows. The undulating sky fleece dissolves in it. The navel has become a sun, a boundless source, the mainspring of the world. It radiates. It has become light. It has become the essential.
For Jean Arp, nature represented purity and innocence. He wanted an art of feeling and delicacy that he felt the world had lost. The young Juan Miró also had a yearning for innocence. Observing his work, Eluard wrote,
When the bird of day, just freshly flying, came to nest in the color tree, Miró tasted the pure air, the fields, milk, herds, simple eyes, and tenderness of the glorious breast gathering the mouth's cherry.
But Miró's art is half delightful, half menacing. His creatures aren't exactly evil, but they aren't as innocent as they seem. Miró's humor often becomes hallucinations. Here, a piece of reality will merge into surreality. André Breton said,
The mind which plunges into surrealism relives with glowing excitement the best part of its childhood.
Miró and Arp both influenced the American Alexander Calder, who made France his second home in the 20s. Calder summed himself up in a light-hearted autobiography.
Father told me once that my objects were too sharp to be caressed and fondled, as one could do with small bronzes. However, I observed a few years later with an object I'd just painted black that somebody took the trouble to caress it and got full of paint. In New York of February 1928, I showed wire animals and people to the Wire Gallery and Bookshop. And he decided forthwith to give us a show. My first show. There were about 15 objects, and we priced these things at $10, $20. 2 or 3 were sold. I gave a few modest presentations of the circus that winter. Mary Reynolds brought Marcel Duchamp to see my work. There was one motor-driven thing with 3 elements. The thing had just been painted, was not quite dry yet. Marcel said, "Do you mind?" When he put his hands on it, the object seemed to please him. I asked him what sort of name I could give these things, and he at once produced Mobile.
The Russian constructivists and Duchamp had experimented with sculpture that moved, but Calder made sculpture that danced.
Jean Arp said to me, well, what were those things you made last year? Stabiles? Whereupon I seized the term and I applied it first to the things previously shown at Persier's and later to the large steel objects I'm involved in now.
The large steel objects were made in collaboration with industrial metalworks. Calder would bring in a studio model, and
all I had to do was to have enough nerve to tell them how big I wanted them. This can be very dangerous, for in addition to having something that won't fit anywhere, that won't even clear the road, you can easily have an enormous bill to take care of. But you're apt to end up with something worthwhile.
For the 50th anniversary of his circus, Calder went to New York. The arena for his whimsical big top was the Whitney Museum.
Sandy, anything you want to do, just do it.
Sandy said there was a bell.
No, because
There was a bell on his neck.
oh yeah, no, but I mean, we just scattered these yeah, right behind there. You want to turn that way? Yes.
The left bank in Paris, the Swiss-born sculptor Alberto Giacometti lived here most of his life. His brother Diego, a lifelong assistant and a sculptor in his own right, still works in the same cramped studio.
Alberto and I worked in this studio for about 50 years. In fact, Alberto practically lived here. He didn't need a big space or want one. Usually he worked at night, especially during the last years. He'd go out to eat at midnight, come back, then work until 8 in the morning. When I'd arrive, he'd be here, even in winter, wearing an overcoat. And he'd say, "What time is it? Is it still night?" "No," I'd say, "it's 8 o'clock." And Alberto would say, "I'd better sleep now. I have an appointment in 2 hours." That's what killed him, his way of life. He left Switzerland in the early 20s because at that time Paris was the center of art. He went to the Académie Bourdelle. Once here, there was no question of leaving. He knew all the surrealists. He had an exhibit here. And then the surrealists got interested in him. He knew Max Ernst and André Breton. They adopted him.
Alberto Giacometti, recalling the 20s.
At the time, everything seemed possible, as if there were unlimited ways to go. I didn't believe this completely, but it encouraged me to try a kind of artistic cycle from sculpture that you could call abstract, like the cube, to sculpture that demonstrated pure feeling, like the invisible object. And then the cycle ended for me.
Before the war, the work of Alberto was dealing with
The artist Matta was a close friend of Giacometti.
Was dealing somehow with expressing the relations of man with fate, with the invisible, with the difficulties that have no name. And so he's tried to give form, a way of reassuring his being against that family of adversities, which are in terms of the absolute. I remember going to his studio and seeing the sculpture of Diego, and it was a sculpture, let's say, about over 1 meter high. When I came back, beginning of 46, it was a tiny little pin, one of these sort of couturier pins, covered with a little bit of plaster, and that was what had been reduced to the portrait of Diego. Now, this attitude explained completely the change of poetry of his work. If before the war, his work was dealing with what we don't know about life, after the war, it was as if he had been hit by something terribly real and terribly stupid, bombing, killing, lying, hypocrisy, etc., etc. And then was no point anymore in searching for an answer to absolute questionings,
Giacometti's figures are described by Jean-Paul Sartre as moving outlines halfway between nothingness and being.
From that time on, I have been searching. I had to start over again, exactly as if I were back at the academy, when it wasn't a question of making sculpture, of completing works of art. It was only a question of learning a new trade.
He worked very funny. I would say that he worked like most people smoke, If people very serious would have come to ask, how do you work? He probably wouldn't have known what to answer, because I don't think he was working in the sense that people used to talk about artists working. He would cover this thing with plaster and touch it, and touch it like chewing gum like that, And it was so funny. To me, it was so funny, and to him too,
I started using a model again to learn construction and composition. And then after 2 weeks, month, 2 months that I had the model, I realized that I wasn't seeing anything at all.
The models for Giacometti's straw-thin figures were usually his wife Annette or his brother Diego.
He always used his wife and me because we were there. The first bust he ever made was of me. He must have been about 9 years old. He was trying to understand how a head is made. For Alberto, my head, or anyone's head, well, it was all the same. After 5 minutes of posing for me, you become a total stranger. You are no longer the person I thought I knew. In spite of your individuality, your head will gradually become the common head, the head of every man. This may seem odd, but it happens with my most intimate models. It happens with my wife. In the end, I don't recognize her. Right up to the end of his life, he never felt that the heads and figures were completely finished. I use canvas or a piece of clay to try to define man as I see him. Now, to my astonishment, this has interested a lot of people. But I'm not particularly happy when people attribute qualities to my work that I don't feel are there.
Ce qui m'intéresse, c'est pas ma sculpture, ma peinture. Mais c'est l'homme.
What fascinates me isn't sculpture or painting, but man.
Giacometti was not the only artist to be affected by the horrors of World War II. When Adolf Hitler came to power, his message to artists, writers, and intellectuals was clear. Intellectuals are a luxury, and we've got to put a stop to them. As the war spread across Europe, many artists had to flee. Those who stayed worked in isolation, cut off and disoriented. In England, the mystical assemblage of rock, called Stonehenge, has inspired modern English artists like Barbara Hepworth and Henry Moore, whose work was finally seen internationally after the war.
My first real experience, sculptural experience, because I know it was sculptural now, was being taken by my father to see a rock. And I remember being very impressed by it, because this outcrop of rock had a kind of curved top to it. And it was so big and so solid. And I was impressed, like I think hundreds, like people generally, are impressed by a big block of stone.
I remember moving through the landscape with my father in his car, and the hills were sculptures, the touch and texture of things. This sensation has never left me. I, the sculptor, am the landscape.
As a sculptor, I consider myself really mainly a carving sculptor, the kind of sculptor who likes the practical, physical action of carving.
When I'm carving, I know what is happening, not by what I see, but what I hear.
When I put a chisel and a hammer in my hand, often I begin whistling without knowing why. Whereas in modeling, as one does with this, there's a less active, less physical thing in it.
The right hand is the motor in carving, and the left hand is the thinking, feeling hand. Feeling the use of the gouge, the chisel, the adze, the point, and the left hand senses the organic structure of the material as it feels its way about the form.
Well, she always used to say that her sculptures was meant to be touched and felt. It wasn't there just to look at.
Barbara Hepworth's assistant in St. Ives, her last home.
She liked people to go around and feel the sculpture. Not like some galleries say, oh, don't touch, don't touch. And she used to like people to feel the sculpture and feel the forms in it.
One doesn't do things for the roughness or the smoothness. You do them for what it is you're trying to express. I like the feeling sometimes of there being energy trying to force itself from inside the material outwards. As you get when you have a knuckle, which a fist which you're clenching, the bones press from inside, and those surfaces have to be smooth. If they were rough, they wouldn't look as though they're being pressed. So sometimes you may smooth the surface, other times you leave it rough. It's what you want to express.
Moore once wrote,
I dislike the idea that contemporary art is an escape from life. Because a work does not aim at reproducing the natural appearance, it is not therefore an escape from life. It may be a penetrating into reality, an expression of the significance of life, a stimulation to greater effort in living.
I have always been fascinated by the relationship of inner and outer form, the relationship of a nut in its shell, or of a child in the womb, or the amazingly different qualities of, say, the inner and outer surfaces of shells or of crystals. I have often been called puritanical, or cold, or geometric. But I try to make sculptures which will affirm and reaffirm the magic of the will to life and the miracle of rebirth and continuity in the universe. It is an act of faith and an urge which is as inevitable as being feminine.
It's silly of people to think that an artist is either abstract or realist. The two things are all the same. It's using your eyes and using your mind and using your sense of form. And shape means solidity and space. And the placing of a sculpture with architecture is rarely ever satisfactory because the architecture has such persistent geometric straight lines in it, whereas in nature, this is why I like my sculpture in nature, if you look here, nothing is geometric, and therefore you're not relating your design sculpture against something else which has been designed. For me, the sky, the green grass, trees, water, all those things are better than the best architect I've ever known. In fact, the scale of the sheep with the so-called sheep piece over there is, for me, ideal. Because my sculpture was all being packed up and there was an awful upset in the studio, which I couldn't work, I began looking at the sheep and I got fascinated by them, and I've always liked sheep, and I began drawing them, and I enjoyed it enormously. And it's that, in fact, that made me realize that the sculpture, which I now call the sheep piece, would be probably liked very much by the sheep.
In France after the war, Germaine Richier emerged as a haunting artistic force. Richier grew up in Provence, where the folklore and nature, its insects, its animals, its creatures of the night, nourished her imagination. At the age of 21, she went to Paris to study with Bourdelle, where she was a fellow student of Alberto Giacometti. Her sculpture expressed the dark fantasies of surrealism and the anguish of existentialism, its obsessions, its fears. Many post-war sculptors searched for new raw materials. The flamboyant César experimented with compressed car bodies and later with liquid plastics.
I am not an avant-garde sculptor. I prefer to call myself a classical sculptor. I live, I create, according to my instinct. The machine is me. The compression comes from the sculptor's vision, not from the object itself. The sculptor wants to dominate a material or technique. I connect first with the vision, then the object. But I'm always in contradiction, because I'm searching for myself. When I made the thumb, it was from my own thumb, enlarged by a machine. It's anti-sculpture, but the enlargement gives it a new language, a transformation, as if by magic. I wanted to make the thumb from a contemporary material. So, looking for this material for my thumb, I discovered the liquid plastics, and I wanted to see how I could control this material, how I could determine the weight, the structure, the size. You see, each form has its own language. It's not modernity in the stupid sense of the word. To be avant-garde is to be nothing. Avant-garde is a minute.
In Germany, about 10 years after the war, several young artists called themselves Group Zero to suggest a countdown for a new beginning. Heinz Mack, Otto Pina, and Günther Uecker, who explained.
I tried to find materials which had the least connection to art, or that wouldn't evoke associations of any sort. I wanted to use trivial workaday objects. We were able to transform the nature of these objects into things that would move of their own accord.
Und wir mehr interessiert waren an einer Kunst der Klarheit und
we were more interested in an art of purity and in linking up again with the main intellectual concepts of the century, with futurism, constructivism, suprematism, the Manifesto of Tatlin, and in finding again a connection in view of the 12-year absence of culture under Hitler with the ideas that we considered the important artistic ideas of the century. We brought art from a static mold into the area of movement, turned the works of art so quickly that they became invisible, thereby proving to the viewer the unreliability of his vision. We brought home to him the doubtfulness, the limits of his own existence, and we expressed through our art a new dimension.
At the same time, another German sculptor, Joseph Beuys, staged performance-like happenings which dramatized his ideological commitment. In the Art Academy of Düsseldorf, where he was a professor during a time of general student unrest, Beuys's antics so attracted and inflamed students that he won a large and insubordinate following and was eventually dismissed. The artist, says Beuys, is an agent for social change, and everyone can be an artist.
I started with art. It was already a result of my experience of science, because I studied before science, natural science, mathematics, physics, and things like this. And then, like more, an experiment, I changed to the field of art. Because I had another feeling, perhaps, what art could reach, I made a lot of experiments. I was thinking about the whole history of humankind and in humankind's future. And then I began already to develop a kind of theory on art and science and how to come out of the insulation of the art, how to reach all people. Because you see in my work, for instance, sometimes felt elements and fat sculptures. And this is because I try to express some other emanations from the material, showing more the sphere of warmth element. This is what I call the warm sculpture.
By warm sculpture, Beuys means works made from materials that symbolize the storage and transmission of energy, such as fat, felt, beeswax, copper. From these basic elements of human survival, Beuys built a radical set of theories. The main objective is to bring all parts of society into the process of art.
And this was the idea to develop a new discipline in art. And this new discipline in art one could call social sculpture.
By the end of the 1970s, Beuys's output was mainly lectures on his philosophy. Social issues and political analysis became his artistic media. He calls this work social sculpture and summons all of us to join him. But for those who resist this summons, there is still one impressive creation, his own image. Meanwhile in Paris, about the time Beuys did his first happenings, a group emerged calling themselves the New Realists. Often described as neo-Dadaists, their high priest was Yves Klein, who used nude bodies to leave an impression on canvas.
We were a bunch of young people trying to make it in Paris at the end of the 50s. We have been called the New Realists. The group was formed as
Armand, one of the group, recalls the early years.
It was Yves Klein, that I met in Nice when I was young. Tinguely, that was a very good friend of Yves. Spurry. And we were showing together, working together, going place together. As you see on the back, there's two pieces there, identical size. One, it's an Yves Klein, a blue Yves Klein, and the other one, it's a piece I made in 1961. Yves gave me one of his panels to work out my own piece. We all had our own tendency. One day we fought a whole day when we signed the common statement, and nobody agreed. But finally we agreed on the minimum sentence. That means new approach of the reality. It's a very minimum sentence. Because one is a mystic artist like Yves Klein, trying to go to purity, to a statement of absolute impurity, and me, I'm working with garbage, with accumulation of existing objects. We decide to take a segment of reality and to make work of art out of it. To take some things from one context, from one use, to change the quality by calling it work of art, I don't think it would have been possible without the previous experience of Marcel Duchamp. Appropriation is what Marcel Duchamp gave us. Sperry was gluing reality, gluing the things on the table as they are. The appropriation is not a free appropriation. You don't keep it for yourself. You give it back to the other by pointing out. They look at the things in a different way. As you know, I'm involved in quantity, in production of objects, in garbage, in consummation. And when I arrived in New York, I fell in love with New York. I felt the strength, the vibration, I felt everything. When I walked first time in my life in Canal Street, I couldn't believe my eyes. That was a paradise. It's the most accumulation ready-mades work already there. So, well, that's my studio. It's like to snatch some things from reality and to do it, to make it your own. It's to be free to do it with everything. Everything is art. So some nice big brushes for $1 a piece. If I buy 100, they might to give it for me for 75 cents. And have a nice size sculpture together for $75 plus my work. It's a nice piece. I know in advance how it's going to look. Tingly using old part of machines to make new machines.
Je faisais de la peinture, je faisais un tableau, je peignais et je...
I would do paintings, one picture after another, and then I'd get a block. I couldn't finish them. That was about 20 years ago. Then I found a system to mechanize pictorial forms. And this let me say, all right, it's finished.
The
man who inspired me most was obviously Alexander Calder. His work affected me deeply. It gave me confidence to move ahead. For me, movement is a beginning. It opens the world of animation and spectacle. And this lets the work, the sculpture or painting, connect with the spectator. So the spectator has a new point of view that gives him a new perspective toward the work of art.
There's something really quite revolting about a lot of sculpture. You know, I think the bad aspect, to me, the bad aspect of sculptors
is rhetoric and bombast, largeness without feeling, and brutality without feeling, and so on.
By the end of the 60s, British sculptor Anthony Caro had reached prominence on both sides of the Atlantic for having pushed post-war sculpture to new limits of abstraction.
For me, it's very important to show my work here in New York. I think that American artists are very accustomed to looking at abstract art in a very critical way and are able to be very tough on it. The standards are very high here.
Caro first came to America in 1959, and it was on that trip he met the late American sculptor David Smith. Influenced by Smith, Caro began making metal constructions, a complete break from his previous figurative style.
Years ago, when I worked for Henry Moore, he used to show me about drawing. He was very, very generous about that. He used to talk about other art, and I saw it was the first time of coming in contact with illustrations of Picasso's sculpture, and I was very excited by the clay things. Big heads with a big nose that came down. I was very influenced by that sort of thing, and then I tried to make abstracts also in plaster or clay. And I reached an impasse really, and then I moved over to a material I knew absolutely nothing about, steel. I didn't know how to cut steel or how to weld it or anything. I just tried to do it, and in the end, I got adequately competent at it. I do think that we've reached a stage, maybe, in sculpture, where we are much freer than we were 10 or 15 years ago. 10 or 15 years ago, for example, it was almost impossible to make a solid sculpture because it reminded one of the human body or of artifacts. And so we almost had to work in thin steel. We almost had to, or in steel, or in blade-like shapes and things, you know.
Caro painted his works in bright colors. He worked within a constructivist tradition of free and open forms, continuing the use of raw industrial materials, whether from the factory or the scrap heap.
I think we kind of got a better vocabulary, so we're almost able to go into solid steel more. I feel more freedom to go into areas which were forbidden me before, and I had to really, before, almost fight my way through to be able to get to what I want to do now.
No, yeah, I think you go up a little bit.
Yeah, go up a little bit.
Not too much. No,
Just where you got it.
No, pull it towards you.
I really think one has exhibitions very much for oneself, to see what your work is like, to see where you've got to.
He's going to get another ladder this way. Jimmy?
It looks different because there are no excuses for it.
That's it. One more. That's it, right?
It's just there in a white gallery. There's no atmosphere of studio around it. There's no other bits of steel. There's no... it either works or it doesn't work. It's either a lot of lumps of steel stuck together or it's art.
The red sculpture. The red sculpture.
To be with art is all we ask, say Gilbert and George, the living sculptors. This recalls the days of Dada in the 20s and the new realism of the late 50s.
Dark shadow and human bondage. Human bondage and dark shadow.
In the spirit of Marcel Duchamp and the Dada poets, these somewhat Victorian English artists have embraced the idea of the ready-made and of performance and body art. They themselves become the sculpture and the pedestal a stage.
Wooden air. wooden air, 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 coming, 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 cherry blossom, 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 cherry blossom.